Number 1. Signs. I don't think a lot of people really realize how scary it can be to live out in the country. I mean, really. Sometimes people hear something and they don't know what it is. Oh, so scary. Or maybe they will see some weird guy dressed shabby and acting weird. Newsflash. That's really the majority of people who live in the country. And it probably seems weird or scary to people who listen to creepypasta narrators because they simply live in a different environment. But hey, I've lived in the country my entire life, and that sort of thing is run-of-the-mill. Do you want to hear a really scary country story? I mean, a really scary one. Make sure you're wearing your diapers, because this one is pretty out there. I grew up in a house that was off a dirt road. Not a gravel road, a dirt road. There was a small creek on the west side of the property, so there was a small bridge that went over it. Not really important, but just setting the scene. I lived in that house all my life growing up, and it was a shabby place to live. But I never thought of it that way, because it was my home. There are some pretty awful people who do some pretty awful things if you travel far enough out in the country. And no, I don't mean there are inbred rednecks who torture and eat you for dinner like in those movies. But there are people who easily break the law, make drugs, hoard weapons, have animal fights, etc. And for the most part, the law looks the other way, because they don't want to disappear. I'm sure most of you probably think I'm full of it, but just consider yourself lucky that you have never had an experience like the one I had with my friend Joe. Of course, that is not his real name, because I don't want anyone to know who we are. And growing up, we was always warned about places we shouldn't go, while we were allowed to explore the local hills. There was an area far off that we were told not to go near. There were supposedly signs on the trees that would warn you to go back. That was what my family always told me. They described the signs and told me if I ever saw them, turn around and get out of there as quick as you can. The people who put those signs up were dangerous. But if you listened to the sign and turned around and left, they wouldn't do a thing to you. I can't tell you how many times in life I always heard, if you're going out into the woods and you see the signs, just turn away. There is nothing to be scared of unless you go past those trees that have the signs on them. Well, as boys get older, two things happen to them. They get both braver and they get stupider. But they also get curious. And to tell you the truth, Joe and I have been exploring the hills around our home for years and years, and we had never even come across these so-called signs that we weren't supposed to go past. Around the time we were 13 years old, we didn't even believe they existed. And they were either something that parents created in order to keep their children from traveling too far into the woods and getting lost or something to scare us like the boogeyman. We didn't believe they existed. And so for a while, Joe and I were going to begin to go deeper and deeper into the woods until we found these signs. Either we would find them or we would not. If we didn't find them, and of course we believed that we would not find them, then we would prove that the adults were just full of crap. and that was exactly what we expected to do. It was easy for us to take trips out into the woods whenever we wanted to. We were 13-year-old boys who grew up in the country. Camping and hiking was sort of expected. So we took trips often, and would sometimes be out for days. We would take our fishing poles with us, and then we would try to find a new creek to fish in. We never really caught much because there weren't too many big fish in the creeks, but it was our thing. And we went further and further into the woods, trying to find these warning signs that everyone always talked about. And weeks went by, and we didn't find anything like that. And we found some old abandoned tool sheds and things like that, and of course we did fish. But we never saw anything that indicated to us that there were people out there like that. Of course, since this is a scary story, you probably know that we had to find something. And yeah, we did find something one time. We had gone out this time, again with fishing equipment. I did wish at one point, however, that we would have taken hunting equipment. That would have helped us out a whole lot more. This was a multiple-day trip. We were going deeper into the hills than we ever had before. Our parents were fine with us doing that. We took a tent and camping equipment. We camped one night and went out the next day. I have to tell you that the area was absolutely beautiful. That was really the reason we did those trips, as after a short period of time, we didn't ever expect to find anything. Joe called out to me. I had been walking a bit away from him, but he sounded really excited. I didn't know exactly what he was excited about, but I was about to get the shock of my life. There was a sign on a tree. It was nailed to the tree, but it was a large metal sign. It looked like a street sign, but it didn't have a normal street sign decoration. The sign read, "Go back, or you're dead." There was some other decorative stuff on it as well. At first I couldn't tell you how I felt. I was a bit excited too, and a little scared. But I was also a bit skeptical. The sign looked like it had been there for a really long time too. It could have been put there as a joke or something. What do we do? I asked Joe. He thought we should go past the sign. I mean, he didn't take it seriously at all. And I was cool with that. I didn't take it seriously at all either at first. So Joe and I went walking past the sign, and we quickly came to a similar sign, and we walked in, and then we found more. There were several signs hanging on different trees. They were all telling us to get out. They were all telling us to get out or get the F out, or you're gonna die. The signs were piling up, and I was beginning to get nervous. I even suggested we really should turn back at one point, and I was serious. It was beginning to get scary. Before I could tell him anything, though, I heard a crunching sound. When I turned and looked, I felt my stomach go completely cold. A young man was standing not too far from us, holding a shotgun that was pointed right at us. "Didn't you see the signs?" the guy asked. "Damn it!" Joe and I immediately and instinctively put our hands up. We didn't say anything, though, because we hadn't thought we would ever be in this situation. "Didn't you see the damn signs?" he asked again. I was terrified. I can tell you at that instant I thought I was going to die. I knew my life was completely over. Joe told the guy we hadn't seen anything. We were sorry, and if he let us go we would leave and never come back. Anyone ever come this far before or did. he said, still pointing the gun at us. But he hadn't shot us yet. It almost looked like he wasn't completely comfortable with the idea, though. That gave us a little bit of hope. We begged to be let go. The guy kept the gun pointed at us, but he began looking around, like he was trying to see if anyone else was around. "Do you know what's going on out here?" he asked us. We explained that we didn't. We didn't see anything. We had no idea what was going on. We swore that we would never mention to anyone that we had found anything. And at the time we meant it. The guy looked down for a moment. And at that moment, though, I thought he was about to kill us both. "Get out," he told us. "No one saw you but me. But if you don't get out of this area, and get out way quick, I'll change my mind. If I see you in town, or in school, or anything, and you tell anyone anything, I will kill you. Go!" And we did. We ran. We were surprised we didn't pee our pants. We ran. We packed up our tent and then we ran some more. We ran until it was dark and we had to put up a new camp. And we spent the entire night terrified. We thought the guy would come and track us down and kill us for not getting far enough away. Every sound was terrifying. We got up right when the sun appeared. We packed up and left. We were not comfortable until we got back to my house. But that's not the end of the story. I remembered what the guy told us. And one part of it was, if he saw us in school. When school started that fall, we saw the guy in school. The first time I did, I almost messed myself. He was a high school senior, and we were freshmen. It was a scary shock, and the look he gave us when he first saw us was terrifying. We did end up talking to him eventually. He never told us what was going on out there, but he did tell us that he had never killed anyone before, but the people he was out there with had. He told us that we were lucky that he was the one who caught us out there. If it had been anyone else, we would be dead. It would have happened in a second. I would like to tell you that this is the first time I ever told this story. It isn't. And it happened a long time ago. But I'm still too scared to put my name on it. Number 2. Unwelcome visitor. I grew up out in the country. Both my parents worked, and it was not unusual for me to be home by myself. I mean, I had a brother and sister, but sometimes they would be at their friends' houses. They tended to have a lot of sleepovers and play dates or whatever you want to call them. And I wasn't really the type to have a lot of friends, so I was home a lot. And honestly, it was because that was what I liked. I was 12 years old, and I was home alone on a Sunday. Both of my parents were at work and my siblings were not home. And there was a knock at the door. I got up and went over to the door. I looked out the window and there was a creepy-looking man outside of the door. I had never seen him before in my life. Now, I lived on a dirt street that only had about 5 houses on it. They were pretty far apart from each other as well. Like getting people to come and knock on the door, especially people you didn't know, was unusual. I knew, however, it was not any of my neighbors. Also, living where we did, things were a lot different than they are in cities. We didn't always lock our door, and we weren't normally suspicious of people. We had a door and a screen door. I opened up the regular door. I only got it halfway open, though, when I noticed something. The man was holding a knife at his side. It It was a hunting knife, and I had no idea at all why he was holding it, but I had a good idea. He noticed that I noticed it. He reached for the handle on the screen door. However, as he was doing that, I had time to go and slam the regular door shut. He had the screen door open, though, and got his hand on the doorknob of the main door. He was able to turn the knob and get the door open. However, right before he did, I got the chain locked on the door. The man began pounding on the door, and I knew the chain would not hold forever. I did the only thing I could think of. I ran into the kitchen and I grabbed a knife from the knife block. Coming back to the door, I began slashing the knife through the small opening in the door. I cut him again. He began screaming and yelling, and hit the door really hard a few more times. I cut him again though, and he must have realized he was not winning this proposition. He screamed at me some gibberish before running off down the street. I locked the door and called the sheriff. The guy was picked up later. He was a convicted child molester, and somehow he knew my parents weren't home. So yeah, that was terrifying. It was good that I noticed the knife before it was too late though. Number 3. Possum hunting. My grandparents have always lived where I would describe as in the middle of nowhere. When I was younger, back before the internet was really a big thing, they were the only house around in the hollow. There were no streetlights, and at night I could go outside and lie in the yard and look up at the stars. There were more stars there than I have ever seen as an adult, and I could even see the Milky Way. And sometimes I'd like to look up into the sky and spin around until I got dizzy. I'd fall into the thick grass and look up at the stars that still seemed to be spinning. The house itself was nestled between 2 hills, with another marking the border of the back of the property. But the property itself was fairly large. Behind the house they had a barn. They kept chickens and hunting dogs, and they had a personal farm where they grew beans, tomatoes, lettuce, and so much more. I loved to visit so much, and in the summer I'd help with the farm. Well, as much as a little kid could help. Basically, they'd hand me a bowl of beans to string, and I'd probably do a half-assed job that one of them would have to redo later, but they never said anything. One of my fondest memories was something my grandpa and I used to do together. He called it possum hunting. Well, he said it with an accent and no teeth, so it kind of came out as pottin' hunting, but I always knew what he meant. Possum hunting was basically my grandpa and me going out after dark with flashlights and looking to make sure there were no possums in the chicken food, random barrels that were around, or in the barn or shed. I'm really not sure that it was ever something that needed to be done, or if he just did it for me, but I always loved it. As an animal lover, I would never have done any real hunting, though it was a common thing in my family. And just spooking possums away from chickens didn't bother me. I don't really remember if we ever even saw a possum. I remember once my dad went with us, and he shook a barrel to scare me and make me think a possum was in it, but I don't know that we ever saw a real one. Still, this game continued as I grew older, and whenever I'd visit my grandparents, my grandpa would ask me to go possum hunting. When I was a teenager, I'd just laugh and brush off the invitation, because surely he didn't expect me, a mature woman, to go outside and chase fictitious possums. I feel a bit bad about that, now that he's gone, but there was a time in my later teens when I got my head out of my ass and realized this tradition was important to my grandpa. This was around the time that I was caring for my nephew. I had moved in with my brother when his wife left him to help him take care of his kid. The little bugger grew on me, and for a year or so, Before someone else got custody, I was a surrogate mom to him. It was for this reason that when visiting my grandparents with my nephew, and the old man came up to me and said, "You want to go potting hunting?" I said yes. He was surprised, and his toothless smile grew. I turned to my nephew, who was about 3 at the time, and said, "You want to go possum hunting?" He had no idea what we were talking about, but the excitement with which I said it was contagious. He nodded emphatically. My grandpa grabbed the flashlights as I put my nephew's shoes on. It was summer, so no need for coats. No one else in the family wanted to join, as usual, so in a few minutes we stepped out the back door and switched on our flashlights. Unlike when I was younger, there were a few streetlights down by the road, but they were far enough away to not give much light to the property behind the house. There was a back porch light, but no one turned it on. This was more of a game than anything, and it was fun to leave that light off for the atmosphere. The first area behind the house was the dog pens. When I was younger, they'd been full of hunting dogs of all sorts. Now there were 2, one of them nursing a litter of puppies we had played with earlier in the day. So we passed many empty pens as we walked, shining the light back and forth. My nephew stayed at my side and looked back and forth with the light, his eyes wide. I imagine he was expecting monsters to be hiding in every shadow, like I had back in the day. He had his own little flashlight and would shine it in the darkest spots. I put my hand over my nose as we passed the old outhouse. I was pretty sure the old man still used it, though I'm pretty sure it was illegal to have it set up like he did. But it had been there forever. Finally, we came up to the barn, which was decaying more and more every year. Without any maintenance, there were broken and missing boards. They were gray and black and crooked, and in the flashlight beams it was creepy. My grandpa put a hand up to indicate that we should stop, and creeped slowly over to some sort of bin sitting outside the door. He creeped really close to it and kicked it, jumping back quickly like he expected to be attacked. I smiled, knowing there was nothing in the bin, and this was just part of the hunt. I felt my nephew's fingers curl around mine, and I gave him a squeeze. My grandpa crept back up to the bin, put his hand on the lid, and paused for a long time. Then suddenly, he ripped off the lid and kicked the bin over, banging his flashlight loudly against it. He had kicked it away from us, so we would not have been able to see if anything had been in it. He hooted and yelled, "Get out of here," at the invisible possum, and my nephew dropped my hand, stomped his foot on the ground, and shouted with him, "Go away!" Grandpa turned around and raised a fist in triumph. "We told that possum," he said, and my nephew, having lost all his fear, cheered and pumped his fist. From that point on, he walked ahead of me, next to Grandpa, and showed no fear. "We have to check the barn now," Grandpa said. Well, again, he said it without any teeth and a thick accent, but I knew what he meant. The old barn door was warped, and I had to help him drag it open. Their chickens usually roosted among the trees on the hills, but a lone hen was disturbed by our presence and clucked disapprovingly at us before walking off to find new roosting spots. It had been many years since I'd been in this barn, and the rickety nature of it scared me. It was sad how it had decayed. It felt like it could fall on us at any moment. My grandpa and nephew were poking their flashlights into shadows everywhere. I looked around with mine and noticed what looked like a broken half of a bear trap. It was probably a trap for some smaller animal, but I had only seen them as bear traps on TV, So that's what it was to me. There were some empty buckets and rotten old rags that had been chewed by mice. An old horseshoe brought back memories of my childhood. My uncle had had horses when I was very young. Sadly, he passed away, and I don't know whatever happened to them. I just remember him riding on the horse with me, and deciding at that moment that one day I would have a horse. I haven't managed that yet. A loud cracking sound snapped me out of my thoughts, and I swung my flashlight towards the noise. I heard my nephew cry, "Get out of here, Possum!" And I saw the back door of the barn had been kicked open, obviously by Grandpa. One of the boards had decided it liked being closed better, and had completely broken off and stuck to the jamb. That was the crack I had heard. My heart slowed its rapid pace just a bit with this realization. I walked through the rest of the empty barn, leaving the memories there in the shadows, where they probably sit and rot to this day. Walking out of the back of the barn, we shone our flashlights around, and saw nothing in the trees on the hills that flanked the property. My nephew chittered on about how good we had done at scaring those possums, and Grandpa shushed him. "We have to be really quiet now," he said. "See that shed?" he asked, pointing at the small shack across the yard. It was where they kept their farming stuff back when they kept up the farm. Sadly, they weren't able to keep it up these days, so I had no idea what was in there now. But I knew Grandpa was just trying to scare my nephew. "That's where the big possum hides." I remembered him saying that to me as a kid, but I was pretty sure it wasn't the shed that he had said it about. But it had been so long ago that I really couldn't remember. I remembered that my child eyes saw all of this as if it were a horror movie. Every shadow was amplified, every sound a possible monster. For some reason, I had enjoyed being scared, and it seemed my nephew was no different. To him, this game was real, and they were scaring off the monster possums to save the chickens. My nephew's eyes were big as he listened to my grandpa. He nodded, indicating that he would be quiet, and we crept across the stretch of grass towards the now rickety old building. It was much smaller than the barn, more akin to a shed anyone would have in their backyard. But just like the barn, it was old and made of wood which was now rotting away. As we got closer, I noticed a scuffling sound. It was a light sound, like someone scuffing their feet on the ground. I listened carefully, sure it was just a normal sound of the night that I wasn't familiar with, but I couldn't place it. We crept closer and closer to the shed, and I realized this was where the sound was coming from. I began to wonder if something was in there. It occurred to me that Grandpa was quite hard of hearing and probably didn't notice it. Before I could say anything, there was a loud shriek and the sound of something scratching at the rotted wood. I grabbed my nephew and had him in my arms in a heartbeat. To my surprise, my grandfather continued toward the shed as if he'd heard nothing. I knew he was hard of hearing, but I didn't think he was completely deaf. Surely he had heard that shriek. I reached out for his arm to stop him, but he sped up and was quickly out of my reach. There were more shrieks and bangs as I yelled at my grandpa to stop, but he just went on and opened the door. I clutched my nephew to me and prepared to run when something large jumped from the shed. It was my brother. He and my grandpa shined a flashlight on me, and my nephew and I burst out laughing. I heard, "The look on your face," and "Got her," amidst the laughs. Obviously, while we were in the barn, he had snuck around us and gotten into the shed. My nephew jumped out of my arms and said, "I wasn't scared." He ran and jumped into his father's arms and joined them in laughing. Traitor. I scowled at them as they came over, my brother slapping me hard on the back as he liked to do, knocking some of the wind out of me. "Don't do that," I snapped when I caught my breath. "Ooh, she's mad now," he quipped, and they laughed at me some more. Feeling very foolish and not wanting to see the humor in it, I turned to walk back toward the house. They followed me, still laughing. I stormed past the barn and covered my nose as we approached the outhouse. "Hey, anyone need a shit?" my brother asked vulgarly. I rolled my eyes, but they couldn't have seen me as they were behind me. "Is it the silent treatment now?" he asked. I was fuming and couldn't decide if I wanted to be mad or pretend I was fine. As I thought about it, my brother caught up to me and stopped me for a minute. He handed me his son, and we stood there and waited for Grandpa to catch up with us. I had wished he found a better place to wait. I hated smelling the outhouse. "I could shit," Grandpa said to my surprise. I was always told he was a vulgar old man, but in front of me he never swore or anything. "You really still use that thing?" my brother asked him. "Well, sometimes," he said vaguely. My brother looked a little uncomfortable and asked, "You want us to wait?" "I think I can shit by myself," he chuckled as he reached the door. My brother shrugged and we turned toward the house when we heard a shriek for the second time that night. But it wasn't my brother this time. It was Grandpa. The old man stepped backwards and fell onto his back as the outhouse door swung open. In the darkness, with just our flashlights, we could see only a dog-sized shape emerge from the small building and dive for the old man's face. Whatever it was attacking my grandpa's face, clawing at it, and his screams were somewhat inhuman, but definitely derived from blood-curdling pain and fear. And I shined my flashlight on it. It turned its grotesque face towards me. It was the biggest, scariest-looking possum I had ever seen in my life. And those things looked scary to begin with, but this was worse. I don't think animals can be evil, but if one could, it was this one. My brother reacted and ran up to the possum and kicked it like he was going for a field goal. He was a huge guy, and the possum was sent flying through the air. When it landed, it ran off into the wood. We helped Grandpa back up, and we knew we would have to get him to a hospital. We went back to the house and my nephew ran inside and shouted happily about how we'd scared off the boss possum. At first everyone thought it was just a story, but when Grandpa entered the room and looked a bit worse for wear, I told them the story the last time we ever went possum hunting. However, to the day he died, whenever he'd see me, he'd ask me with a wink, "You want to go possum hunting?"
Hey all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, please feel free to hit the subscribe button and the bell below, or wait for the icon of Ichigo the cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment to let me know what you thought of the video, and consider sharing it with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.
Doctors/surgeons/nurses of Reddit, what's the worst thing you experienced while at work? Taking care of a fall patient that broke her pelvis. She just found out her husband had cancer and she wouldn't be there for him. She was crying, telling me that he was there for every appointment and treatment when she had cancer, and now he'd have to go through it alone. When I was a CNA, I got into a situation where I didn't have gloves on and got poop on my hand. I scrubbed like everything after and moved on with my night. A while later I absent-mindedly chewed my fingernail and tasted, you guessed it, poop. I vomited and dry heaved. Ran to the bathroom and scrubbed my mouth out with soap. It took a while for that taste to go away. Ah, the good old CNA days. I remember giving this old man a shower that needed assistance and a shower chair. While he was sitting down, I kneeled down to wash under his legs and was behind the back of the chair. He proceeded to have the loudest, most explosive diarrhea/fart I've ever witnessed. Needless to say, some of it ended up in my face. Watching another nurse pulling a fall mat away from a patient's floor next to her bed. When asked why, she said in front of the patient, she about to die anyway. Her mouth was stuck open because she was so emaciated, but she could still cry. Her frozen face somehow allowed her to still cry after she heard that, and she did for a long time. I sat there with her. The patient was in custody of the state, a mental hospital, and they chose to withhold food and water. A type of forced DNR. She was around 90-something. We were forced to watch her slowly starve to death. I quit right after that. Had to tell a guy he had killed his mother whilst he was high on methamphetamine. Former paramedic, long story short, got a call for what turned out to be a very dead, decomposing man who had passed alone in his apartment. His body was filled with gas, fairly common to be honest. As I'm standing by the body calling the hospital to give them a heads up about what's about to come their way and get approval to move, new EMT decides to poke gas-filled body. It explodes. He loses a hand and a trillion vaporized bits of dead old man cover me, got in my open mouth, under my clothes, etc. Taste was awful. After hundreds of showers I could still smell corpse on me. My SO at the time said every time she nuzzled me or got close to my hair, she could smell it too. It was like that for about a week. Still makes me gag to think about, and that kid's life was pretty much permanently changed. Wait, the new EMT lost a hand in a body explosion? Yup. A lot of gas can accumulate in dead bodies, and if it gets trapped, it can be almost like a bomb. New guy was kneeling next to the body. I think this was his first serious call because he had that kind of glazed over, I'm in shock, look in his eyes, and he put his hand on the guy's stomach. It sank down into this bloated, gas-filled sack until said sack just broke. My crew chief said it would be like sinking your fist into a box of firecrackers. Honestly, not sure how he came up with that analogy and didn't really work in my mind. But yeah. Dead body exploded, got gunk everywhere and took off the EMT's hand. Longest incident report I have ever filed. I frequently experience terminally ill patients dying in excruciating pain with no euthanasia laws to support them, and people like my mother, who was, also an experienced ERRN, and who also asked for similar assistance when she was dying. Vet nurse here. Had a staffy come in one night whose labor had stopped. We gave her the drug she needed and the labor started back up. Sadly, it had stalled for so long that the next 3 pups up the line were dead. Their placental sacs were already green and necrotic looking. We managed to save the last 2. Now, we let mom have a normal labor with normal behaviors, so this meant that she ate those 3 necrotic placental sacs. Naturally, mom then threw this up but onto her 2 surviving pups. It was a lot in a small round bed and I was afraid the pups would aspirate, so I quickly stuck my hands into the mess and picked them up. But this also lifted the smell straight up and into my very soul. In the very next heartbeat I threw up on mum. It's the only time my job has made me sick and was one of the worst nights at work ever. I was sitting here horrified at the thought of all that as well and then went back and read, vet nurse, and it all made sense. This case in my internship made me give up on specializing in pediatrics. Young boy got brought in for rheumatic heart disease, already in heart failure. Apparently, this all started from a minor skin infection and went all the way up into his heart valves. We met him already in the PICU. He was still conscious and able to talk, and so for his first day we built a sort of rapport. The next morning, before my friends and I clocked out, he wasn't looking so great, so the resident in charge called in the general surgery team to perform a cut-down to expose his veins for access. I had to hold down the poor kid during the procedure, since local anesthesia could only do so much. He was screaming, so I told him, "Just hold on, we'll get through this." He nodded and said okay. That was the last conversation we had. When I came in for my next shift he was already intubated. The only parent with him was his father since his mother was employed overseas. Now for many of these cases, a letter to the employer is needed to explain why so and so must go home in this case of family emergency. I volunteered to draft the letter and send it out so we could get this lady on a flight soon and have her come home for her son. As soon as I put the last period on that letter, I was typing in the nurse's station. The kid coded just a few feet away. We couldn't bring him back. The next worst part of course was telling his father what had just happened and asking if he wanted us to stop the resuscitation. That conversation will stay with me. No one should have to bury a child due to something so preventable. Not a nurse but a tech working on becoming a nurse. I've got a few stories. The saddest one was a woman who had an aggressive but treatable cancer. She was riddled with guilt from all the debt her family was incurring, and broke down when she told me she wished she would just die soon so that the debt would stop accumulating. That one hurt to hear. And then the grossest thing I've had. In addition to the guy that was throwing poo at me every time I stepped in the room, I had a patient that was over 500 pounds. I had been told that she had a sacral wound, and that during the night I would need to prep her for surgery in the morning. So the night is going on. Everyone is crapping themselves repeatedly and I'm trying to keep up. Then I go to get this woman's bed prepped for the surgeon. I step in the room and this lady tells me that she's had a bowel movement. I did not need her to tell me. It looked like she was sitting in a tub of old, congealed pudding. It leaked down the sides of the bed and had spilled out onto the floor. At this point I backed out of the room and went to get some backup on this situation. So, there's another tech and 4 nurses, for a total of 6 of us that were going to tackle this. Each of us had at least 3 contact gowns on, and we put on 2 masks with a layer of alcohol swabs and Vapo Rub in between them. Basically, everything short of going in with full hazmat gear, but honestly, I wouldn't have turned down a nice Tyvek suit. So we step into the room and all get to cleaning the rancid swamp out of the room. And I mean cleaning it off of things that should never have had poo on them. So it's finally cleaned up to the point that we can actually approach the bed and get to work on the patient. We all position ourselves properly to roll her to the side, and it takes all of us to roll her. I happen to be on the butt-facing side for this, pushing her up. As we get her on her side, I see some gauze packed into her butt wound. Not unusual, but I knew it would be pretty gross. Problem was that the gauze had become one with the fecal material at this point, and so I basically had to reach in and start unpacking it with my hands. And it just kept going deeper. I was prepared for a nasty wound. I was not prepared to be elbow deep in this woman's butt, and as I unpacked it the smell of rotten feces began to hit, even through our defenses. One of the nurses stepped out and threw up into one of the vomit bags. So here I am, elbow deep inside a woman, cleaning the remnants of Lake Michigan off of her literal tailbone. And apparently accidentally snagged a couple sensitive spots, because of the couple times she yelled out and smacked me in the head. Eventually we managed to get the wound clean, packed it with fresh bandaging, and disinfected the whole bed, and finally she was ready for surgery. I had that smell trapped in my nose for a couple days afterwards. Just about all of us needed a few minutes to retch, and in some cases vomit a little after the whole ordeal. And then I got to go back to check in on my turd-throwing friend again. Application to med school now and bin. CNA worst things you experience are the people you're not allowed to euthanize. The people who live in agonizing hell for decades, where you feel like a torturer when you're holding them down to let the nurse stick her 30 centimeters suction tube down their throat. I felt bad when I had to help force this man to stay alive. I wish I could take every euthanasia critic to show him/her the suffering some people go through because we force them to live. Life just is effed up at times. Sometimes we're powerless and death is just the best option. Diarrhea blood fountain. Edit, because people asked for the story. I was a third-year med student on my 3-month internal medicine rotation. For people who don't know, this is generally the time in your life where you feel the most stupid every minute of every day. I had arrived for work just barely on time at 4:30 a.m. for my 5/7 3-hour shift. Of course I was dressed to the nines because medicine is stupid sometimes and you have to dress to impress. Tie, nice shoes, slacks, button up, that sorty thing. Might as well have had on tails and a top hat. Imagine a monocle for effect. I started rounding of course. I went in to see Mr. HIPAA. I had seen him for several days at this point and he was usually pretty chipper. He had been in the ICU for a GI bleed, but had done great and now stepped down to the floor. This morning he wasn't talking very much. That's not unusual though, it was 4:42 a.m. and I was barely conscious myself. But something felt off and there was just an odor in the room. My spider sense was tingling so I checked the bathroom. They always say you only have to smell Melina once to never forget. This was my once. The floor, the toilet, the walls, were covered in that inky black butt spray. I was assaulted by the pungent aroma of iron shavings and death. It was icky. So I went. Oh crap, Mr. HIPAA. I'll be right back. I toddled off to find one of my residents. Those lazy bums didn't usually wander in until after 5. Managed to find my chief who seemed uninterested in what I had to say. I wasn't Chicken Little, I had never cried wolf before. I remember this seemed fairly important and him showing no interest whatsoever. Bad resident, no donut. So I went to the real power on the floor, the nurse's station. They promptly did the wrong thing too. They check his BP and systolic is in the low 80s. Prior had always hovered in the 130/40s. My internal dialogue is screaming. That boy ain't right. But my third-year medical student body is standing there, now surrounded by multiple nurses, just trying not to get in the way and trying not to look even more stupid or say the wrong thing. Well, they want to move him to the chair. I still, all these years later, have no idea why. I managed to squeak out should we be standing him up right now given the crazy low BP and massive blood loss? But an M.S.3. Speaking is like a fart in the wind, so I went unheard. So we stand him up. I'm holding onto his left arm, another nurse on his right. He had little strength to support himself. A half a gallon of blood-tinged crap, or crap-tinged blood? Promptly falls out of his butt onto the floor. I mean it literally fells. Imagine moving your china cabinet and it tilts a little bit and the dishes just fall. It didn't squirt, or spray. It just fell as a mass, hitting the floor and splashing out. At that point Mr. HIPAA decides, enough with being conscious. And promptly passes the F out. It could have been something to do with, he now had a HGB around 3 and went from laying to standing with a BP on the lower end of life compatibility. Now, I'm a regular-sized big guy, 6 feet, 200 pounds. My nurse was 5'3", 120 pounds. Mr. HIPAA was 6'3", 250 pounds. There was no stopping this fall once it began. Timber. He fell face forward and planted right into his bed. Crisis averted. My moment of joy was instantly changed to terror as I looked down at his bare butthole, jackknifed into the air like a Whataburger A-frame. Then it happened. Diarrhea blood fountain. The perfect symmetry of it as it exploded from his butt is something I'll never forget. It was like the Bellagio, or Buckingham Fountain in Chicago. Just this perfect fluid dynamic cone that reached 1.5 feet into the air, then gently allowed gravity to pull it down, making that gorgeous trumpet-like flare. Except it was made of diarrhea and blood. Before I could think, suddenly Spy Break by the Propeller Heads was playing. For those not in the know, that was the song that played in the lobby scene in The Matrix. I, in my tie and fancy clothes, was Neo. My concrete pillars were the various nurses. They took hit after hit, while I dodged like Christian Bale in Equilibrium. I danced, I juked, I spun like no one has ever spun before. I was the Fred Astaire of crap swerving. When it was all said and done, 3 nurses lost their lives that day, meaning were covered in crap, while I, who had been staring down that fleshy barrel, had gotten away without one speck of red or brown or black on me. The outcome. Mr. HIPAA went back to the ICU, little bit of PRBC, another embolization, and he was home happy and healthy 2 weeks later. I got in trouble for not letting my resident know what was going on. What? And as far as I'm aware, those nurses are still showering to this day. I was an operating room nurse and I assisted a hemipelvectomy after a large vehicle crushed a patient's whole left hip. The connections were severed, his bladder was in tatters and the whole left leg had died, so it had to be amputated from the hip. I held the leg the whole time. Worst part is that it was a 9-year-old boy. Not me but my wife, had a toddler about 2 to 3 years